The carriage wheels crunched upon the gravel drive as guests began to arrive at Wexford Hall. The grand manor, set deep within the Oxfordshire countryside, loomed with centuries of history etched into its stone walls. Torches burned by the entrance, casting flickers of light across the ivy that clung to the facade. It was a night of celebration, for Lady Margaret Harrington had reached her 70th year. Inside, the drawing room glowed with golden chandeliers. Laughter mingled with the sound of violins as members of the Harrington family and their invited guests filled their glasses with champagne. Among them stood Eleanor, her dark hair gathered neatly, her eyes quietly observant. She had always felt herself a little apart from the splendor of her relatives, though her loyalty to the family was unwavering. At the center of attention was James, the eldest grandson and heir to the estate. Tall and confident, he carried the easy charm of someone raised to inherit both wealth and responsibility. Yet there was a restlessness in his gaze that Eleanor could not ignore. When their eyes met across the room, he gave her a half-smile, though it did not reach his eyes. Lady Margaret, resplendent in emerald silk, lifted her glass. Her voice, though aged, still commanded the room. She spoke of family unity, of honor, and of the generations yet to come. The guests applauded warmly, but beneath the polite cheer lingered an undercurrent of tension. Rumors had long circulated of disputes over inheritance, and Wexford Hall had been the stage for more than one quarrel in recent years. As the evening pressed on, Eleanor noticed James slipping quietly from the hall. Something in his manner unsettled her, as if he carried a burden too heavy to be shared. She made a mental note to seek him out later. Yet by the time the clock struck midnight and the orchestra reached its final notes, James had vanished entirely. His room stood empty, his belongings left untouched, and a sense of unease rippled through the great house. The celebration had turned into a mystery. The hush that fell upon Wexford Hall after James's absence was unnerving. What had been a night of laughter now carried an air of dread. Servants hurried along the corridors with lanterns, their faces pale, while guests whispered nervously, unwilling to leave yet fearful of what might be discovered. Eleanor pushed open the heavy oak door to James's chamber. The room was untouched, his coat neatly folded upon the chair, his boots aligned by the bed. A half-finished glass of wine rested upon the desk beside a candle guttering low. It was as though he had stepped out only moments before and vanished into thin air. Lady Margaret entered behind her, leaning on her cane. Her eyes swept the room, sharp despite her age. "He would not leave without a word," she murmured, her voice edged with steel. "Not James. Something is amiss here." Eleanor glanced at the window. It stood slightly ajar, the curtains stirring in the night breeze. Beyond lay the dark expanse of the estate grounds, silent and foreboding. She shivered as a strange thought took hold. Had James fled, or had someone ensured he could not return? Downstairs, Richard Harrington, James's uncle, raised his voice above the anxious crowd. He declared that the young heir must have gone off on some reckless whim, that there was no cause for alarm. Yet his words rang hollow, for everyone knew Richard's resentment toward his nephew's place in the line of inheritance. As Eleanor searched the desk, her hand brushed against a folded slip of paper tucked beneath the wine glass. She opened it slowly, her heart pounding. The message within was scrawled in a hurried hand, only 5 words long. "They will never let me stay." The room seemed colder as Eleanor read the words aloud. Lady Margaret's face drained of color, and a silence deeper than before settled over the chamber. Whatever had happened to James, it was clear now, his disappearance was no accident. The corridors of Wexford Hall seemed to lengthen as the night deepened, every shadow stretching like a warning. Eleanor clutched the slip of paper in her hand, her thoughts racing. The words written by James suggested fear, a force greater than his own will. She could not shake the notion that danger lurked within the very walls of the house. As she stepped into the gallery lined with ancestral portraits, hushed voices reached her ears. She halted in the darkness, straining to listen. 2 men were speaking in low tones near the staircase. One was unmistakably Richard Harrington, his voice sharp and impatient. The other, quieter, belonged to Mr. Green, the family's long-standing solicitor. "You promised this matter would remain buried," Richard hissed. "If James discovers the truth, it will ruin everything." Green's reply was muffled, but the words, inheritance, and documents, drifted to Eleanor like poisoned darts. Her heart pounded as she pressed herself against the wall. Whatever scheme they discussed, it was entwined with James's disappearance. Suddenly, a floorboard creaked beneath her foot. Richard's voice cut through the silence. "Who is there?" Eleanor froze, scarcely daring to breathe. The light of a lantern swung closer, its glow sweeping the corridor. She slipped behind a heavy curtain, her pulse thundering in her ears. The lantern's glow paused mere steps away, then slowly retreated. Richard muttered something under his breath and moved on, though suspicion lingered in his tone. Eleanor emerged, shaken but resolute. She could not trust Richard, nor could she rely on the solicitor. If the truth was hidden in documents, she needed to find them before anyone else did. Yet as she turned to hurry back towards her chamber, she nearly collided with a figure emerging from the shadows. It was Clara, Richard's daughter, her pale face framed by loose curls. The child's eyes were wide, frightened yet purposeful. "Miss Eleanor," she whispered, clutching something close to her chest. "I know where James has gone." Eleanor knelt to Clara's height, her voice gentle yet urgent. "What do you mean, my dear? Where is James?" The child's small hands trembled as she uncurled her fingers, revealing a silver key glinting in the dim light. "He gave this to me before supper," Clara whispered. "He told me not to tell anyone, not even Papa. But I heard him say he was afraid of being sent away. He said this key would show the truth." Eleanor took the key, its weight strangely heavy, as if it carried centuries of secrets. She recognized the crest engraved upon it, the Ashford family seal. Only doors deep within the manor bore such locks, doors seldom opened since her grandfather's time. "Where does it lead, Clara?" Eleanor asked. The girl hesitated, glancing down the shadowy corridor. "To the west wing. The locked rooms. James said there are papers there, something that could stop Papa." Before Eleanor could question further, footsteps echoed along the hall. Clara stiffened, her eyes wide with fear. Without another word, she slipped back into the darkness, leaving Eleanor clutching the silver key. Summoning her courage, Eleanor made her way towards the west wing. Few dared to tread there, the rooms had been sealed for decades, filled with dust and silence. As she approached, the chill of the corridor deepened, and the sconces upon the wall sputtered in the draught. At the far end stood a heavy door bound with iron. The key slid into the lock with a reluctant click. Eleanor pushed it open, the hinges groaning as though disturbed from slumber. Inside lay a chamber lined with cabinets and leather-bound ledgers. The air smelled of paper and age. On a central table, beneath a sheet of dust, rested a wooden box stamped with the family seal. She brushed it clean and lifted the lid. Neatly folded within were documents marked confidential, their ink faded yet legible. As she spread them across the table, her breath caught. The pages told of debts, of land quietly sold, of signatures forged. And among them, one name appeared again and again. Richard Harrington. Eleanor's hands shook as she traced the forged signatures inked across the pages. The scope of Richard's deceit was staggering. He had been siphoning wealth from the estate for years, concealing his crimes beneath the Harrington name. If James had uncovered these documents, then his disappearance was no mystery at all. The sound of footsteps in the corridor made her snap the box shut. She extinguished her candle and pressed herself into the shadows as the door creaked open. Richard entered, a lantern in his grasp, his face tense with suspicion. He scanned the room, his eyes lingering on the disturbed layer of dust upon the table. Eleanor's breath caught as he stepped closer. She held herself still, her back against the cold stone wall. Richard's gaze swept the chamber, then narrowed as he noticed the faint outline of a hand in the dust. He cursed under his breath. Suddenly, the lantern light flared against the opposite wall. Someone else had entered. Lady Margaret, her emerald gown trailing, stood tall despite her frailty. "Richard," she said, her tone heavy with command. "What business do you have here, prowling the West Wing at such an hour?" Richard's face tightened. "Merely ensuring the house is secure, Mother. With James missing, one cannot be too careful." Her sharp eyes searched his, unconvinced. "I know when a man hides guilt. And you, Richard, wear it plainly." Eleanor dared not move, for discovery now would cost her everything. Richard bowed stiffly and muttered, "You misjudge me, Mother," before leaving with his lantern. Once he was gone, Lady Margaret remained in the doorway, her eyes fixed on the room as though she sensed another presence. Eleanor wondered if her grandmother knew she was there, hidden in the shadows. But Lady Margaret said nothing. She turned and closed the door, leaving Eleanor alone with the weight of the truth. Eleanor steadied her breath. She had proof of Richard's betrayal, yet proof alone would not bring James back. She folded the documents beneath her cloak, determined to find where her cousin had been taken. And then, from somewhere deep within the manor, came a faint cry. It was muffled, desperate, and unmistakably James. Eleanor froze, her blood turning cold at the sound. James's voice, faint but undeniable, had echoed through the ancient stones. She pressed her ear to the wall, straining to catch it again, but silence fell, leaving only the echo of her pounding heart. Clutching the documents beneath her cloak, she hurried through the corridors, following the direction of the cry. The manor was a labyrinth at night, its passageways narrow and twisting. Her candle sputtered in the draughts, threatening to leave her in darkness. Still, she pressed on, guided by instinct and fear. At last she reached a narrow servant's stairwell seldom used since her childhood. Dust coated the steps, disturbed only recently. She descended cautiously, her hand sliding along the rough stone banister. The stairwell led deep into the bowels of Wexford Hall, to a part of the house rarely spoken of, the old cellars. The air grew damp and heavy as she entered a corridor of low arches. Chains clinked faintly against the walls, remnants of a time when the estate had its own holding rooms. A lantern burned dimly at the far end, casting long, sinister shadows. Then she heard it again. A muffled plea. "Eleanor." Her heart leapt. She followed the sound, her footsteps soft upon the stone. At the very end of the corridor stood a door reinforced with iron, its edges sealed with rust. She gripped the handle, but it held fast. From behind the door came the scrape of movement and a voice choked with desperation. "Help me, please." It was James. Eleanor pulled with all her strength, but the door would not budge. She pressed her lips to the crack between the wood and iron. "James, it's me. Hold on, I will find a way." Suddenly, footsteps thundered above. Voices called, angry and urgent, echoing down the stairwell. Richard's voice rose clear and commanding. "She has the papers. Do not let her escape." Eleanor's breath caught. She had been discovered. Eleanor's mind raced. The iron door would not yield, and Richard's men were descending quickly. She pressed her hand against the cold stone walls, desperate for an escape. Her fingers brushed against a faint groove, almost invisible in the dim light. A hidden seam. She pushed hard, and the wall gave way with a low grind of stone. Behind it stretched a narrow passage, cloaked in shadow and damp with centuries of neglect. Without hesitation, she slipped inside, clutching her candle close. The wall swung shut behind her just as voices filled the cellar corridor. "Search everywhere. She cannot have gone far," Richard commanded, his tone laced with fury. Inside the hidden passage, Eleanor pressed herself against the wall, barely daring to breathe. The air smelled of earth and mildew. Her candle flickered, throwing quivering light upon carvings etched into the stone, strange symbols, weathered by time. She ran her hand over them, her pulse quickening. These were not random marks. They were the crest of her family. The passage wound deeper beneath Wexford Hall, twisting and turning until Eleanor lost all sense of direction. The silence pressed upon her ears, broken only by the distant echo of footsteps fading behind her. Then she heard something new, a soft tapping, rhythmic and deliberate. She followed the sound, her candle lighting the way. At last she reached a small chamber, its ceiling low and its walls lined with rotting shelves. In the center stood an old wooden chest, its lid secured with a heavy lock. The tapping came from within. Her breath caught. Slowly, she approached. "James," she whispered. The chest rattled violently in reply. Eleanor fell to her knees, fumbling for a way to release the lock. But before she could act, the sound of shifting stone echoed through the chamber. Another entrance was opening, someone else knew of this place. And they were coming inside. Eleanor froze, her candle trembling in her hand as the secret entrance groaned wider. A tall figure stepped into the chamber, the flame of a lantern throwing harsh shadows across the stone walls. It was Lady Margaret. Her grandmother's face was pale, her eyes sharp and unyielding. She moved slowly towards the chest, her hand grazing the carvings as though she had walked this path many times before. "So you have found him," Lady Margaret said, her voice low and steady. "It was only a matter of time." Eleanor's throat tightened. "You knew? All this while James was hidden here, and you said nothing?" Lady Margaret's expression did not falter. Richard was reckless. His greed endangered the family, but James was the greatest risk of all. He discovered the truth about our fortune, about the bargains struck centuries ago. He wanted to end it, to free us from obligations that bind us still. But freedom comes at a cost. Eleanor shook her head. "He is your grandson. My cousin. You cannot lock him away like a prisoner." Margaret's eyes glimmered in the lantern light. "Every choice I made was to protect Wexford Hall. To protect you." At that moment, the chest rattled again, a muffled cry escaping through the wood. Eleanor's resolve hardened. She seized a rusted iron bar from the floor and struck the lock. It snapped open with a metallic crack, and James pushed the lid free, gasping for air as he stumbled into her arms. His voice was hoarse but defiant. "The truth cannot be buried any longer." Behind them, Lady Margaret stood motionless, the lantern flickering in her hand. For the first time, doubt crossed her face, though her silence was heavy with unspoken warning. James clasped Eleanor's hand tightly. "We must leave. Now." Together, they fled into the winding passage, their steps echoing through the darkness. Behind them, Wexford Hall loomed like a living thing, its ancient secrets restless within its walls. The air seemed charged with something unseen, as though the house itself was listening. And as the siblings vanished into the shadows, the voice of Lady Margaret followed faintly, a whisper that clung to the stones. "This is only the beginning."